And I think that in this world of polycrisis, we need systems thinking more than ever. And education is a very important piece of the world system.
How do culture, language, governance, curriculum, pedagogy, and institutional capacity shape whether AI becomes a force for inclusion or exclusion in the global south?
To what extent do you feel AI systems can or are being designed to maintain local cultures and languages?
There's no technology on Earth that can substitute for the hard, unglamorous work we need of building coherent education systems that requires deeply human work.
But I think there's also another dimension of the context and the system in which the education tools we use operate in. So that's the ministry, the schools, the school leaders, the principals. Do they have the capacity? Do they have the resources?
We need to train teachers to be able to understand what AI is, how it's related to their subjects.
Welcome to the Digital Education Dialogue podcast brought to you by the Digital School, where we explore the evolving relationship between education, technology, and global development. My name is Waleed Ali, and I'm pleased to welcome you to season 2 of this series. This season, we are focusing on artificial intelligence in education, not from purely technical lens, but also through questions of equity, access, culture, policy, and system transformation, particularly in the context that are often underrepresented in global AI conversations. Today, joining me as a co-host, Dr. Lesley Snowball, Education Director at the Digital School. In today's episode, we turn our attention to a critical and a timely contribution in the field, a book titled Artificial Intelligence and Education in the Global South, a Systems Perspective. Why the Global South matters. Of course, we will talk about it, but generally 85% of the world population and 90% of the children live in the Global South. And we'll talk more about the challenges that this Global South have and the opportunities that AI promises and maybe fail or succeed in delivering, and how we look into that. This book moves beyond tools, pilots, and asks harder questions. How do culture, language, governance, curriculum, pedagogy, and institutional capacity shape whether AI becomes a force for inclusion or exclusion in the global south in specific? The authors argue that AI in education cannot be understood or implemented in isolation. It must be approached as a part of a complex interconnected system, where progress in one area, such as technology, means little without parallel advance in teacher readiness, curriculum reform, public policy, or ethical governance. We are honored to be joined today, and truly honored, by authors of this book, Fernando Reimers, Zainab Azim, Callysta Thony, Maria-Renée, and allow me to begin with invite each one of you to briefly introduce yourself to the audience of this podcast.
Thank you so much, Dr. Waleed. I'm Fernando Reimers. I'm a professor of international education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I spent most of my life studying how to transform education systems so they empower disadvantaged students to become architects of their own lives. And it really is a privilege to be with you because we admire your own commitment and the commitment of the digital school to deploying the resources of technology to support marginalized learners, to really make education an avenue of opportunity for students to become architects of their own lives and people who can shape their communities. Let me turn it over to my colleague, Zainab.
Thank you, Professor. Hi, my name is Zainab Azim. I'm a teaching fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and the Kennedy School. I'm originally trained as a neuroscientist, so I studied child development and learning science research, focusing a lot on STEM education and in global South countries. I then worked in government and the nonprofit space, and I'm interested in how we can ensure that the benefits of education are not left to chance, but it is a choice that we make at the systems level, and we deliver that to every child in the world, of which, that's right, most 85% are in the Global South. So thank you for having us. I'll pass it on to Maria-Renée.
Hi, my name is Maria-Renée. I'm from El Salvador. I spent 10 years studying in France and working in the public sector consulting. And then I switched to education. I'm currently assistant director at the Education Lab for Latin America, and I'm passionate about improving education in the Global South. Thank you. I'll pass it on to Callysta.
Great to meet all of you, and thank you so much for having us. I'm Callysta. I'm originally from Indonesia, but I've spent a lot of time working with governments and nonprofits globally, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, and most recently in Mexico, and of course, Indonesia. I spent a lot of time thinking about how technology tools can be used to really transform in a deep way, not just improve things. And I think that's a big theme of our book, thinking about how artificial intelligence is one of those technology tools that do more than just improve how things are and really open up new horizons for us. And so I'm really excited to be part of this conversation and think more deeply about the use of education, AI and education in the Global South. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lesley, maybe you can introduce yourself and start the questions from your side.
Thank you. Dr. Lesley Snowball, Education Director with the Digital School. I was born and educated in the UK, but I've worked for 35 years internationally all around the world, culminating in several years in Dubai with the government of Dubai, and then most recently working remotely digitally with the Digital School as the Education Director. Very happy to have you all with us and very excited to go through our questions around your book. Let me start by giving you a very broad question, really, because I'd like all of you to, I hope all of you can contribute to this. We're really interested in not only the findings, obviously the findings are very, very interesting, and the examples you shared are very exciting and give a lot of hope for what's happening. But we're also interested to know what the motivation was. You mentioned the purpose at the beginning of the book, but what were your motivations in doing this? I think that would be a great starting place. Thank you.
I think that the motivation that brings us together is a desire to take stock of how AI is being used and to align that with what we know are the biggest challenges, educational challenges in the Global South. So in a sense, our goal was to democratize existing knowledge, state-of-the-art knowledge about the potential, the opportunities, but also the risks that AI presents to education. And illustrative of that motivation is the fact that we made our book open access. It's a book that can be freely downloaded by anyone around the world. We're delighted that in the few weeks since publication, 22,000 people have already downloaded the book. And we've organized a few webinars coinciding with the end of the year holidays in the United States, and hundreds of people have participated in them. So we realize there's a real need. I think that was the overarching motivation. I'm going to turn to my colleagues. I'll speak for my personal motivation. Over the last decade, I've been leading the Global Education Innovation Initiative, trying to understand what is it that education systems need to do to help students develop skills that would help them face the challenges of the 21st century. And as part of that work, we've created a lot of knowledge on what works, but also what the bottlenecks are. About 3 years ago, I began, as a result of Harvard's impetus in getting faculty to pay attention to AI, to educate myself on this technology. I can tell you that when ChatGPT was first released in our university, as in many places, the first response was the response of the ostrich, was to bury our head in the sand, was let's ban these because students are going to cheat. But of course, it didn't take us very long to realize that this was the wrong answer, that if we were going to prepare students to function in a world in which AI drives much of how we relate and how we work, we had to help them master those skills. So the school created a range of professional development programs for faculty from which I benefited. And one of the things that was a mind changer for me was reading the book Co-Intelligence by Professor Ethan Mollick at the University of Pennsylvania. And I read that book and I began to think differently. I began to incorporate AI in my teaching. I will eventually write a book based on all the experiments I'm doing in my teaching, incorporating AI. And I think that was the motivation. Last year, Zainab, Callysta, and Nene, who were then students at the master's program in the School of Education, had the idea of organizing a conference around AI. And they asked me if I wanted to be a faculty advisor. I said, absolutely. And it was a phenomenal conference in which they invited some of the people that basically said, are working in that space. And I realized in the conference that there's a real need for a roadmap. So I talked to them and said, why don't we actually write a book? This could be a real contribution. So that's the story of my own engagement. I'd love to turn it over to them to speak about their own motivation to participate in this joint project.
Just to build off of what Fernando shared, I see this book as an extension of the conversations that we started at that conference. And Lesley, you mentioned the risks and the potential, and that's the conversation that's happening. We wanted to, in that conversation, extend it to the reality of what we see happening. And we also talk about risks and potential, but really, what is AI actually doing on the ground in these contexts? And we wanted to have that conversation in a way of it's not just focused on the tools and the technology, but it starts from the place of people and the actual problems they face and the pedagogy and the learning. And so this book is also an invitation to continue that conversation. And the webinars that we're doing in this podcast, thank you for having us. We hope that people will also share their ideas and the work that they're seeing and the impact that they're seeing so we can continue that conversation.
I would also add that having worked in the Global South, there's a lot of unique constraints that oftentimes what's published out there doesn't quite address. And I think this book was a great opportunity to really pick with a fine-tooth comb, like what are the examples that are coming from those contexts where the set of challenges, the resources, the capabilities of teams could look very different, where learners are in much bigger classrooms. I think that's what we outlined in one of our earlier chapters of this book. But there was also that motivation on I think all of our behalfs to really look at what evidence is out there in terms of specific pilots and examples that have been tested in those contexts before we start to push this as a big solution that really transforms almost like a silver bullet for a lot of places. So that's something that I might add as well.
And I'll just finish saying that we also wanted to make a book that's easy to read. People have their own jobs, they don't have enough time, and if they're only interested in knowing about what is happening in AI and curriculum, they can just go and read the AI and curriculum chapter. And we have the use cases, we have tables. So we also wanted to have an easy to read book for the Global South context. And it's made for practitioners, policymakers, teachers, students, parents.
Okay, thank you very much, all of you. I had prepared a few questions, and interestingly, when Fernando mentioned, that each of you have special areas, my questions align quite nicely with those areas. So maybe I'll jump into those. Maria-Renée, first of all, I think Fernando indicated your specialist area or your focus area was curriculum. And one of the things that stood out to me was your emphasis on integration, not standalone, remote or discrete subjects. And I think that's really interesting because although that in theory seems to be the answer, you integrate, it needs everyone who teaches and school leaders to be comfortable, competent, confident in relaying those skills. And I would love to hear your perspective on that, because I've seen integration go very badly wrong in many scenarios. An example would be when we had a movement for language across the curriculum with the strapline of every teacher a language teacher. So now we're going to have every teacher an AI teacher. How do you see that playing out in reality?
Thank you so much for your question. And it's also interesting because when we were writing the book, we wrote first the teacher professional development chapter before writing the curriculum one. So they both go together. In order to enable integration of AI across subjects, we need to train teachers to be able to understand what AI is, how it's related to their subjects, and of course, we need a co-creation of the curriculum with the teachers, so that way what they are teaching is understood by teachers. So this co-creation aspect of AI, we mention it a lot in the book, because we want teachers to be part of the solutions, be part of the technology that is used. And of course, the ideal would be not to have only an AI literacy class, but have AI in math, AI in language, AI in history. But we know that in reality, we cannot have that for the moment for all countries. But we put what AI could do, and in the chapters we also put what AI is already doing. So we really make the distinction of what the ideal would be and what happens in reality.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Waleed, I'll proceed through my questions, but of course, when you want to jump in, please jump in. Another question then, probably this is for focused really on for Zainab, with regard to PD. Obviously, there's lots of crossover. But AI is often accused of promoting lazy learning, in my words, factual knowledge, focus on simply learning facts and not teaching students critical thinking, etc. How would you respond to that?
I think you're right. That is the common accusation. It is, again, a tool. It is not, a lot of the general AI tools that we see are not made for education, right? So if you want to develop these competencies that we call 21st century competencies or deeper learning, whatever you want to name it, critical thinking, collaboration, right? Those are deeply human skills, right? So even if we've seen education focused tools that prompt students further and teachers further in developing critical thinking. I think this is why, on the teacher PD side, you can't replace the educator. When you attempt to do that, then it removes the opportunity to develop this more holistic sense and these holistic skills that we have. However, AI can be used to support teachers in doing that. We know that there is a shortage of qualified teachers in the Global South, and I want to distinguish the fact that there are many differences across Global South countries. Even that term can be problematic because there are so many differences within countries themselves, between private and public schools. But given that reality, right, when a teacher is focused on, Nene just spoke about the curriculum, we distinguish between the intended curriculum, the implemented curriculum, and the achieved curriculum, right? So in order for teachers to actually be able to implement and get to the achieved curriculum that we have on those documents, and I know, the UAE has its own AI literacy framework and curriculum that way, then you need support tools for teachers to be able to implement that and achieve the intended outcome. And so AI can be a support tool in coaching teachers in a way that we weren't able to do before, because it's very expensive to have one coach for every teacher, a human coach for every teacher. But if AI is able to make teachers focus more on the human aspect of teaching, building relationships with their students, developing those critical thinking skills, facilitating collaboration in contexts where it is very difficult to do that right now when you have 40 or more students and most of your work is administrative, not instructional, then there is that potential. So AI on its own, this is why we say teacher plus AI can be better than AI alone or teacher alone if used properly and if used to build the capacities of our educators to bring the human elements back into education.
Yeah, thank you very much. One of the things that you focused on in the book was contextualization, as we call it at the digital school, trying to localize, trying to tailor things for different contexts. And you've just made that point again, Zainab, when you said, how different, not only how different each country is from another country, but within a country, there are major regional differences, urban, rural differences in gender, etc. How do you think, to what extent, this isn't only targeted for you, Zainab, but maybe Fernando would like to answer this. To what extent do you feel AI systems can or are being designed to maintain local cultures and languages? I know this is something you mentioned several times in your book, and I'm interested to know what examples did you see that would evidence that this is actually happening, or that this is a major challenge that we need to be aware of?
So the question of making sure that AI is deployed to solve real problems that people have in particular contexts and to address real needs, as opposed to imagine problems that developers think they should have, is a very important one. It's a theme running throughout the book. And one of the reasons, if I had to summarize the audiences that we have for this book, they include certainly education practitioners, teachers, and administrators, and people working at the system level, um, as well as people working in organizations supporting systems, such as those of you in the digital school. But they also involve developers, the people who are the engineers, who are coming up with these ideas. And I think that when we look at the history of the use of technology in education over the last 3 decades, one of the reasons I think many of the promises that were raised by the technological revolution were unfulfilled is because people didn't take enough time to understand what are the problems that teachers and students really have, or administrators. And instead, they came up with solutions to problems that they thought they should have. So let me give you a very specific example. With some colleagues in Brazil 2 years ago, we surveyed a couple of hundred teachers in public schools, and we asked them, what are the main problems that you face that you wish you had a superpower to address? And then we looked at how not just AI, but technology more general could address those problems. And it could solve all of them. And yet, when you look at the menu of existing implementations of AI or technology for that matter, there's a big mismatch. So I think there's a big message here to the developer community and to those uh, who are generating applications. Begin understanding the people, begin understanding the needs of students, of teachers, begin understanding what problems they have. And that relates to all kinds of problems, all kinds of challenges, not just the problem of language. So yes, if I had to summarize what we have seen, a lot of the implementations seem to show that mismatch. And so that's an area of promise that remains unfulfilled. And our hope with this book is to correct that, is to stimulate those conversations in technology companies, is to get people to adopt it. I mean, a lot of people talk about human-centric design, but it's performative talk. It's basically virtue signaling, saying, yes, of course, we begin with the customer in mind, but they don't really. They don't really. And there's an old saying I teach a course on innovation at Harvard, innovation, which is if you cannot ride with them, you cannot serve them. If you cannot spend time with the people you are trying to serve, you cannot serve them. You cannot serve them from a distance, from an office, from a development agency, from the headquarters of a foundation. So that's what I would say about localization. The other thing that I would say to your earlier question, Lesley, about, well, are we going to expect every teacher to be a teacher in AI? My answer would be more nuance. It's not either or, it's both and. And let me explain. Perhaps using as an example the course that I teach in education policy. This is not a course on AI. I don't teach my students algorithmic thinking or bias. But when they finish this course, they have used AI every week. Let me give you one example of how they use it. I engineer a lot of prompts for students to basically engage with the material. And so here's one of the prompts. It's a prompt that tells the AI, it's one of these large language models, I want you to draw on these 3 readings exclusively. So you can constrain. You can constrain the corpus of knowledge that AI goes into so that it doesn't go into everything that it has been trained on, which includes, frankly, a lot of garbage, a lot of misinformation. And so the texts that I send them are 2 analyses, 2 case studies of 2 national education reforms, very well studied over a 20-year period. And I tell them, and then the other 2 texts that they read are frameworks to think about how to design a reform at scale. And the prompt is, I want you to role play the Minister of Education at the beginning of that reform and I want you to ask me questions about how to proceed. And then I want you to give me feedback on my questions based on how they reflect a deep understanding of these two theories. And then go through several rounds. And at the end of that, give me some feedback on what I need to study more. So when you have a student do that every week for an entire semester, they actually develop a component of AI literacy. They may not know how to code their own bot. They may not know how to build their own AI, but they understand AI a lot better than before engaging in that experience, both in terms of the possibilities, but also in terms of the shortcomings. They realize, for example, one of the exercises I engaged my students in was an exercise in which the engineer, the prompt, looked at reflections of former ministers of education of very successful reforms. And they had to reflect, and many of them came back saying, well, the AI was giving me responses that were flat, not as multidimensional as the responses of the ministers. So that's a way, in the book, we say, in this age in which AI is going to be part of our lives, there are three new goals for education systems, and I would argue also for universities. One is to develop AI literacy. The example I have just given you of how I use it in the class is one component of developing AI literacy, the capacity to use these tools intelligently. The second thing is use AI to make education more effective in teaching the goals they are trying to teach. We argue in the book those goals are foundational literacies. We're failing miserably. And AI is not an alternative to, it's an avenue to help those systems do what they haven't been doing very well. And so in my case, I think I'm teaching AI not so that students understand AI as a silo, but I'm using AI so they learn education policy better. And the third goal is we think AI can help education systems be more relevant in teaching a range of cross sectional skills, the skills, what you call, Lesley, the skills for life, the skills that transversal skills that are not subject specific, and which I think many education systems actually don't do a very good job of teaching those skills. Now, our view is that every teacher should have the skills to deploy AI to do those three things. They don't need to become a software engineer. They don't need to be able to code their bots, although increasingly that's very easy to do. But they need to know, how do I use AI as a form of co-intelligence so I become a better teacher? And I agree with you. There is a lot of work to do in that domain, in part because we're not actually using what we know about effective professional development. There is a corpus of knowledge on what works and what doesn't. We know that a short workshop of an hour isn't going to do very much other than make people curious about something. Well, we should deploy that knowledge in building professional learning communities so that teachers become more proficient.
You allow me to maybe add into that. I think since the rise of AI, we've been seeing every day new framework for AI, new framework, and we get all the frameworks that tell you the what question, which everybody kind of know, but nobody dig deeper into the how and how it reflects within the pedagogy. And this is what I think is great about your book, that goes into uh, 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 I would say a big radar view of eagle eye view on systems approach, but then you go to the core elements of educational process, whatever is it, PD, classroom, school leadership, curriculum, and how AI should be looked at within the how process. So uh, my question is first on that part, but also why the global south from a system perspective? Isn't it harder than the other than global south, because the system perspective is a much more holistic, much more complicated uh, angle to take?
Maybe I'd like to invite my colleague Callysta to say a word about how our book takes what AI can do for the governance of the system, which I think is at the core of your question. And then I'd be happy to chime in after she talks. Is that okay?
Just a quick note on contextualization, I think, which is one of the points that Lesley brought up earlier, which I think is also linked to this and having a systems perspective. On context, I think we're often tempted to think about just the culturally relevant aspect of it, which is making sure it's relevant to the curriculum that's used there or the language or, incorporating some aspect of local culture into what's taught. But I think there's also another dimension of the context and the system in which the education tools we use operate in. So that's the ministry, the schools, the school leaders, the principals. Do they have the capacity? Do they have the resources? And I think with AI tools, they get better as they become more accurate, and they become more accurate through more data, which means having data in the first place about the context that you operate in. And so that's just one point I wanted to bring in. That's something that we're hoping to advocate for, and we bring in throughout all of those chapters as a cross-cutting theme, bringing up that point about, is this relevant to the place that they're in, both from the perspective of content, but also in terms of the system? And I think that brings us to why we chose to write a systems perspective book, because oftentimes we were realizing that a lot of the literature that's out there is only focusing on just one small component of the AI universe, in that it only talks about just the curriculum, but doesn't think about the curriculum linked to the teacher professional development that would need to happen, or conversely, the governance and the structures of how what policies would be used to control or manage AI use, how it would be scaled from school to school, how principals would be equipped. And so I think we're trying to offer the different pieces of a bigger puzzle through this book. As Nene mentioned, obviously tying back things that are relevant to each, what may be the focus of each person, but I think we're trying to bring in those different aspects. And I think in the Global South, that's an even more valuable perspective, because there's a temptation often to just see this very shiny new initiative and put a lot of money into that where there's resources available. But all the more that a systems perspective is needed, because there's so many missing parts. For example, do they even have the right digital infrastructure or to scale some kind of solution? Do they have the connectivity for that? Do teachers even have the sufficient level of digital literacy to operate these solutions? And we trade on that. And so I think those are some of the questions that we were hoping to ask through the different parts of this book and through a systems perspective, specifically in the Global South. Go ahead, Fernando, if you want to.
Let me just add a word about why the Global South. I think we're living at a time of multiple crises converging with possibly very harmful consequences for the future of humanity. I am referring to the breakdown of a rules-based order, the rise of nationalist movements around the world that cause people to give up on the notion that we're all in this together, that we're members of the same species, traveling together in a very fragile planet, and we're either going to survive together or to sink together. I'm referring to the climate crisis. I'm referring to forms of violence within and among nations, and to poverty and inequality. And I think all these crises converging tell us that the future could be very grim indeed. But I think moments like that are also moments of opportunity if we have the capacity to think differently, to think outside the box. I think it was Einstein who said you cannot solve a problem using the same way of thinking that created the problem in the first place. And in my view, systems thinking is a way to think differently about these problems. One of the greatest systems thinkers that I know is Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum. I'm reading his last book, which I recommend, Thriving and Leading in the Intelligence Age. Klaus was brilliant when he created the forum because it basically was a platform to help people see the world and problems through systems. In fact, my first visit to the Emirates was when the forum organized in partnership with His Highness, the Global Agenda Councils. And we would come to these meetings, hundreds of people from around the world. And I was for a while leading the Global Agenda Council on Education, but we were in conversation with people looking at energy, people looking at conflicts, people looking at climate. And there is something very generative that happens when you can make connections across the dots and you can see the big picture. And I think that in this world of polycrisis, we need systems thinking more than ever. And education is a very important piece of the world system. There's a lot of hope in education. I think that nations can come together more easily when they think about the future of children than when they think about the divides that set them apart at present among adults in a society or across society. So that's one reason for systems thinking. Why the Global South? Because honestly, that's where the future of this planet is. The future of humanity is going to be decided It's going to be shaped not by what happens in Boston or even in the US or in the Emirates. It's going to be decided by what happens in the places where most of humanity lives. And I think one of the risks, as I think you know, I was part of the UNESCO commission that drafted the report on the futures of education. And it became very clear to us that inequality and poverty and exclusion are at the root of a lot of global instability and at the root of a lot of the potential for conflict. And what I can see is that if we let present trends continue, if we don't make a concerted effort to get ahead of the disruption that AI is going to cause in education, systems that are already very inequitable will become more inequitable. I will give you an example. At Harvard, the university has decided to let every faculty and every student to do everything they want with AI. And we're giving every member of our community access to 8 language models, premium version for free. I know enough about education around the world to know that that opportunity is exceptional. And so what is that going to do for the skills? If we don't pay attention to these, AI is going to produce a generation of superhumans, if you want, people who really are able to lead in the intelligent age, who are going to be so divided, so far apart from other people who don't even understand what this technology is or who use it to write their papers for them. So that's the reason for systems thinking and for the global south. And I really want to underscore, read this book. One of the greatest benefits that I drew from my friendship with Klaus over the years was to learn to look at the um, global risk assessment framework that the World Economic Forum produces every year, where they survey hundreds of people. They ask them, what are the biggest risks that humanity faces? And it's something that I read every year. It's released in January. The new one is coming out soon. It doesn't make me sleep better, but it actually helps me understand the future and understand the future not passively, understand the future, understand different scenarios about the future. When I think about the future, I don't think that anyone can predict a single future, but I think it's very useful for all of us to have the ability to see different futures and to understand that some of them are a lot worse than others. And then if you understand that, you can map pathways that make the better futures more likely. And right now, I would say we are on a pathway in education where a better future is not the more likely. The more likely future is one where education will actually deepen the elements of this polycrisis that I have described.
Professor, at policy level, maybe if you continue on the what just you said is when we started digital school, we got this like digital education, marginalized community. What is this? There is priority for food. We need priority for health, for electricity. So this is never going to work. And now we are saying AI in education should be there. I've been through that challenge, but what's your message to policymakers when they immediately think of this? AI is not my job. I barely can do digital education or schooling, so let me focus on food.
My message is, I think one of the mental traps that doesn't help us solve the polycrisis is a mentality of scarcity, is a mentality that sees the world in simple categories that lead to either or thinking. I'll give you an example of this in education, very common. I so often hear people say, well, we have to choose between teaching people to read or teaching people to think or teaching people creatively. And of course, when I hear that, it immediately tells me that those who suffer from that mentality of scarcity have not really spent a lot of time in the classroom. Because when you actually have been in the classroom, you realize that those things go together. That when you teach people to read, they have to read something. You teach them in a certain way. That teaching them to read is activating the human imagination. But I do think that this mentality of scarcity causes a lot of harm because we have these battles. I mean, they're big battles between whether the development community should really do foundational thinking or 21st century skills. And I say, oh my God, how much harm are we causing because of our own incapacity to think in a context of abundance. So I think that, we think that we have to choose between education and food. To me, reflects that mentality of scarcity. Why? Why does it have to be either or? In a world in which we have the resources that we have, in many ways, we are living at a time of more resources in human history. They're not being distributed equally, but when you think about the power that most of us carry on our iPhones, it's more power than the power that existed in the best Harvard computer when I first arrived in this university 4 decades ago. And so that's my answer to policymakers. I realize that, and that's why we hope this book is going to make a contribution, that sometimes our imagination is constrained by our lack of knowledge. So when many people think AI, they think that you need to have connectivity, a device for every child, and high bandwidth. And of course, I think that we will get there sooner than we imagine. But in the book, we talk about one of the most innovative developments called unplugged AI. And what is unplugged AI? How do you use AI in places where kids don't have a computer and when there is no access to internet regularly? What does unplugged AI look like? The students do some homework in the traditional way. Teachers take a picture. When there is connectivity, they upload that to a platform. And then there is a script that helps them analyze the work of the student and provide feedback to the teacher to individualize treatment for the student. This is extremely helpful. We don't have that. And it's actually not a concept. This has been done at scale in Brazil. We talk about it in the book. So my suspicion is that many of the policymakers who say what you describe, Waleed, don't know about these possibilities. And they only know the AI that maybe their children or people they're close by access to. And of course, they realize those schools are so different to the schools that most students attend. So my bottom line on that question is, I think the first prison we need to get out is the prison of our own mind or of our own imagination. And imagination can be activated by two things: knowledge, talking to others, as Klaus Schwab did, causing people to talk across sectors, outside your own sector. One of the most beneficial things that educators could do is to spend time talking to non-educators. And this would be beneficial both ways, right? Don't spend a lot of time in our bubbles, in our silos. And then the other one is some audacity in thinking, getting used to asking, why not? As you know, Waleed, years ago, I developed a world course. At the time when I developed it, people thought it couldn't be done. This was a course that was going to basically teach students the skills to understand the SDGs and to have the skills to do something about it. And, we spent 3 years developing that world course. We worked with a lot of very well-trained educators, and that world course caused the students in the second grade to learn about poverty. And I remember one of these very well-educated persons from one of the fanciest schools here in Massachusetts tell me, you cannot teach second graders about poverty. And my answer was, why not? What makes you think that? Of course, you can teach second graders about poverty. It depends on how you do it. And you do it in a way that builds agency. So I think we have to become more accustomed to challenge ourselves and others in asking why not.
I just wanted to quickly, briefly add, I know we're running out of time though, is this question of AI versus funding other things. I would just 3 quick points. One is AI is here, and we've had this concept of whether it can bridge the divide or deepen it. So if some countries are using AI and educating students in AI, and others are not, we are going to see a further deepening of that divide. So that's number one. Number two, though, is the way that we talk about AI in the book is not just AI for the sake of AI and educating just on AI. It's, can we use it in service of improving foundational learning? And even you mentioned food. There's also tools that are helping farmers in Malawi increase crop production, right? Using satellite data. So I also, that framing of it's not just an either or, is can we use it to serve foundational learning? And in the cases that we cannot, that's why we looked at the reality. We don't think that's a good investment. We don't think the money should be going there. That's why you need to start with the people and the problems and the systems perspective, because AI cannot be used or deployed in isolation. And when it is, we are seeing that there's no evidence of an impact that's worth investing in, right? So that's what this book is offering, is it's not either or, it's how to use it thoughtfully and smartly and whether to use it at all.
Maybe one more point on that, if I may, Dr. Waleed, is that there's a lot of questions that we raise in this book because we realize that that evidence that Zainab was looking for was lacking, severely lacking, like systemic, organized, well-studied interventions. We haven't quite seen enough of that, and I think that that was something that surprised us while creating this book. We thought there would be much more examples. But obviously, it's in very nascent stages, and we're understanding of that there can't possibly be an RCT for everything already, nor should that always practically be the standard of evidence that we're looking for. But I think that's a big call to action in this book, to pose future research questions that really help us answer the questions that you're asking us here of whether or not there should be something to invest in. I think that should be guided by data, guided by evidence, and not just evidence in a pilot level, but wide scale implementation.
Which takes us to this kind of paradox of between pace of action against no pace of, okay, let's wait and do proper monitoring and evaluation and evaluate and see how it works. And by the time you say, okay, it's good to use ChatGPT 3.5, and you are far ahead of the technologies, the pace that AI is moving, the regulators are always asking, where do we start? Or where we should start first? And this is a very, regulations will always be slow, but policymakers need to know that they should and they must take action. Otherwise, the train is moving very fast.
My answer to where do we start? We start where you are with the knowledge that you have, and you start tomorrow. You don't sit in your hands until you have the perfect answer. We knew when we wrote this book that the book was going to be dated the day it was printed, because there are developments that are happening so rapidly in AI. But if we had sat there waiting, we wouldn't have the benefit of this roadmap, which the people who have read it tell us it's actually very useful. Understanding that, well, maybe this reflects the world as it was a year ago. But let's face it, given where most people are, knowing the world as of a year ago is really far away from where they are in their reality. So my answer would be, you start today with what you know, you do the best you can, and you keep improving.
If I could add to that, start with the book. I think the book gives you a helpful guide of how to navigate this space, right? There's so many topics, there's so many sub-themes, and I think the book also synthesizes a lot of the evidence that's already out there for you to make a more informed decision of what works and what doesn't quite work yet, and what you could do. I think one of the big questions we ask is, what could AI do? Not just what has it done already, but what is the transformative potential that we're actually seeing? And I think that's a great place to start imagining beyond what you've already seen and you're used to, like a tutor or using ChatGPT to help edit an essay. And I think if I could make a special pitch to those in government or in the policy space, starting with good data is very important, right? To know where your system is performing right now. And knowing where the weaknesses are. Like I mentioned earlier, the contextualization aspect of AI is not just the content, but also the accuracy of the model being specific to your specific location or the schools in your area. And so I think if you can build good data and good infrastructure, that as a policymaker, that helps you have a better overview and use AI to then better understand your system. And that doesn't happen if you don't invest first in the right infrastructure for that or good data, which I think is a step that people often miss because they're so excited to reap the benefits of a really great solution. So that would be my slight, I guess, pitch for policymakers who are listening in.
I'll just add that I'll start having a systems perspective because AI is not just entering in a classroom, it is interacting with every layer of the education system, with the curriculum, the assessment, the teacher PD, school management, the governance. So by having this systems perspective, we would know where to start.
I would just like to add a couple of things not related specifically to that, but just to start to draw us to a conclusion, because I noticed, Zainab, you need to leave, and you've been very generous already, all of you, in giving us some extra time. But one point that I think really gives me hope that I want to highlight, and then another point that gives me a really good action point for us generated directly from the book. The point of hope is, Fernando, you talked about, how people focus on resource scarcity and when defining countries or systems. And I think one of the things we should keep in mind is how, not resources, but how the resourcefulness of educators. I've worked, and I'm sure you all have worked with educators all over the world, and some of the best teachers I've worked with have been those with the fewest resources. I think it's a risk in well-resourced systems and schools that teachers can become quite complacent and almost greedy for resources, and then almost a learned helplessness of, oh, well, if I haven't got the latest resources, I can't do anything. And the best teachers I've seen have been literally with no desks, even just a stick to draw illustrations in the dirt or a piece of chalk to draw on a simple chalkboard. And that, you know, a good teacher can teach well without the latest resources. And I think, therefore, those are the teachers who bring hope, because they will see the potential in AI to apply to their own teaching, to their own pedagogies, and tailor that for their own students. That's my point of hope. And my point of action that I'm taking away from this, you talked right at the beginning about the webinars, and the webinars with a purpose of listening to our communities, the people we want to serve, that we say we serve, getting closer to them, listening to them. And I think the webinars, you know, are a great way to do that, to share the book, as we've said, we'll try to do, try and bring some of our school leaders together, some of our educators who are really interested, because that way, I think, and we've seen this in other ways with other aspects of education, you allow champions, as we've called them in the past, to just come out of the masses, and they show themselves to be interested. They don't have to be knowledgeable, but they're interested and passionate, and they have a measure of confidence to encourage, as you also mentioned, Fernando, to use their imaginations and imagine things that nobody's told them are allowed yet. And I think those 2 points for me are really positive takeaways from this. Personally, I hope this is absolutely not the end of the conversation. I'm going to hand over back to Dr. Waleed to close this off. But I would really hope that, you know, we could meet again, continue the conversation, not for a publication point of view, but selfishly to just throw ideas past you that we want to do for digital school, get more of your thoughts and how they link to what you've seen. And yeah, let's hope that we can do that maybe once or twice more during this year, if your time allows. So, thank you. Dr. Waleed, over to you to close.
Thank you, Dr. Lesley. Maybe before closing, a final opportunity for you, any of you, to share any closing reflections or thoughts for today's conversation.
Yeah, why don't we all say something? Let's begin with Zainab, then Nene, then Callysta, and then I'll say something at the end.
Sure, thank you. I think I would just say that, like this conversation, our book is encouraging a call for honesty and humility when we talk about AI in education, and we also go into the environmental risks and the fact that a lot of the workers who are dealing with the back end of AI are in global South countries. And so we don't ignore those, even though we haven't brought it up in this specific conversation. But what I would just like to end with is that there's no technology on Earth that can substitute for the hard, unglamorous work we need of building coherent education systems that requires deeply human work. But what AI can do in the right ecologies and conditions, right, is address specific bottlenecks that we haven't been able to solve in the last 40 years in terms of the impossibility of personalizing learning for 60 students, heterogeneous students, right? The shortage of mother tongue learning materials, the isolation of underprepared teachers. But I would close with those possibilities right now just remain possibilities. We haven't seen that type of transformation. It's mostly been minor improvement and innovation. And that is why we need to recenter the people and the problems that they face. And so if you're not having teachers in those conversations, or students or parents, we would encourage you to do so and to resist the hype. have some hope, but let's also live in the world of reality and make sure that we're working with actual human beings to create solutions that serve them.
Thank you, Zainab. I'll just add saying we have so many unanswered questions in the book, in each chapter, in the conclusion. So, and we're only 4 people, and we would love for everyone that's interested in AI to answer those questions. So, thank you.
I would add that one of my favorite phrases from the book is open-minded agnosticism. I think that captures the kind of lens that we hope people start to use when it comes to AI, kind of balancing what Zainab said about honesty. And I think the importance of evidence. I think this is a pitch for me on really for those who are supporting research to really put the money there to help us really make these decisions about where to invest more money in. And to build that evidence base of good uses good use cases as well as bad ones, the ones that didn't quite work out the way that we expected or that worked out differently. I think there's a big gap of that, and bringing that evidence to people who are making decisions about where we're investing more of our education resources, which are very finite and scarce, in. So that would be something that I would like to close with. Thank you.
I'd go back to the important point Lesley made on the resourcefulness that exists, even in very under-resourced environments. I wouldn't go as far as saying that there is more resourcefulness there, but in my long career as an educator, I've come to understand that there are 2 kinds of people, not because they are born that way, but because their experiences have made them that way. And they're well summarized in a phrase that the writer George Bernard Shaw wrote in his play Back to Methuselah. And the phrase is, you see things and you say, why? But I dream things that never were, and I say, why not? And what that refers to is that there are some people who get easily stuck in the world as it is and in the problems. And there are people who, when they see problems, they inevitably think about what can I do to bring that solution. I see that every day in my interactions with my students, with others. I lead a concentration here of which Zainab, Nene, and Callysta are examples. And just to give you an example, we suggested to those students, spend time with each other because the relationships that you form are going to be the most valuable learnings that you get. And we said, why don't you organize some dinners to come together? And they stepped up and they did it. Some of them did it, some didn't. And I similarly encouraged them, lead, shape the curriculum, organize things like conferences on topics that interest you for your benefit, for the benefits of others. Some did as they did, others don't do. I wouldn't say that it's only people in under-resourced environments that have that mindset. I think that the experiences that people have in life help some of them develop that agency of asking why not, and other people don't develop that agency. My hope is that we can transform education systems so that every person has that agency. Because I think with Mandela, the only thing we need to fear is the knowledge of how much power we have. Because once you have that knowledge of the power that you have to make the world better, you cannot rest if you're not using it to make the world better. And I think there is great power in building communities of people who see the world that way. There is great power in bringing people together, not the naysayers, but those who step up, those who ask why not, and say, let's actually make things happen. And I think that's what you're doing in the digital school. You're building that community of innovators, of educators. I admire that work that you're doing. I hope you persevere in spite of the obstacles. I wouldn't get hung up when people look down and say, why are you working with the poor, the downtrodden, the marginalized? Because I've seen very often that the greatest innovations come from the most marginalized communities. 2 educators I greatly admire, Pestalozzi and Maria Montessori, work with people who are considered discards in their time. Pestalozzi worked with orphans, and of his work with orphans came an extremely powerful set of ideas about what does it mean to educate the whole person. Maria Montessori worked with children who were mentally ill, and out of her work came one of the most powerful movements to, again, educate the whole child. So I think that there is great promise in working with the people and in the places that are not flashy, that are not in the spotlight, that maybe the places that not many people care about. And I hope that you will continue in that undertaking. You can always call on us in helping you further that mission. Thank you for the privilege of speaking with you today.
Thank you very much. And I'll hold on to that promise. In closing, This session has been deeply thoughtful and important conversation. Thank you, Fernando, Zainab, Maria-Renée, and Callysta for your insights and for your contributing to such a grounded system-driven perspective to a field that urgently needs it. We remind our listeners to read the book. We will add the link in the description or the info field, and also a link to join the seminars that will be taking place. It will be, I promise, informative and insightful like this session. Thank you to our team in preparing and directing this podcast with us, Rasha and Hani. And thank you to our listeners for joining this episode of the Digital Education Dialogues. Until next time, thank you very much.